So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on measuring lifestyle behaviours and their health impacts with wearable technology. My name is Hannah Williams, and I work at the University of Exeter as an Impact and Partnership Manager within Health, and I'll be chairing the session today. Before I introduce the speakers, I want to let you know a couple of housekeeping instructions. The session today is live and being recorded, and the recording will be shared with you all after the event, and some clips may also be used in some of our promotional activities, such as the website and other social media channels. Your microphones and cameras will be turned off during the speaker session. So if you would like to ask any questions, please do use the chat function, which can be found in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And if you could please indicate which speaker this is directed to, or whether this is for both, that would be great. We obviously would like to try and make the session as interactive as possible, recognising the limits of Zoom. So once we get to the Q&A section, if you would prefer to unmute yourself to ask a question, if you could raise your hand using the reaction button, which you can also find in the toolbar, you'll then be able to unmute to ask your question. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our two speakers for the webinar today. Joss Langford is the CTO and founder of Active Insights, and Melvin Hilsden is Associate Professor of Exercise and Health Behaviour at the University of Exeter, with a research focus on physical activity, epidemiology, and public health. They will be presenting for the next 30 minutes or so, and then we will open up the session to questions, and we'll try to get to as many of these as possible in the remaining time available. I do hope you find the session useful and informative, and look forward to seeing what questions you have for our speakers. Over to Joss and Melvin.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. Just to give you a little bit of background, further background around Active Insights, before I hand over to Melvin to do the same. Active Insights, for those who don't know, it is a digital healthcare company that specialises in the objective measurement of lifestyle and behaviour. We do that using professional wearables that we manufacture ourselves in the UK. Melvin, over to you.
Thanks, Joss. So at the University of Exeter, I lead a small research group called Physical Activity and Health Across the Lifespan, which works with a range of different populations in helping support clinical trials, surveillance studies, intervention studies, where using wearables may provide extra insights into people's behaviours that people don't normally get access to when they rely on things like self-report measures. And along with Activity Informatics, we run an active teaching program within sports science, and we run a module that helps people understand a bit about physical activity and public health. Thanks, Hannah.
So I'm going to share my screen now and do a presentation, and Melvin's going to then follow on behind that. So, as we've just described a little bit of background to Activity Informatics there, as a collaboration between the Melvin and myself and the organisations we represent, I'm going to give a little bit more information about Activity Informatics itself, the way we think, the way we work, and the types of work that we do. Melvin's then going to pick up the threads of that with some real case examples and the more interesting stuff as well. So the collaboration aims to drive best practice in the adoption of objective measurement of remote monitoring technologies in public health research and non-commercial clinical trials. And we do this in three main areas: around deployment services, around biomarker development, and measurement expertise. And over the next 10 minutes or so, I'll raise a couple of points around each of those three areas to explain our work. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about remote monitoring. Why is remote monitoring important? So why are we focused in this area? Very often, this is around reducing burden for participants, and particularly when we're working in the clinical trial space, remote monitoring allows participants to be involved in studies without asking to come to clinics, and it can remove some of the more arduous aspects of reporting within the field. But it also allows us to do very different things when we move measurements from out of the lab and clinic and into the free living environment. And that ability to measure patients, participants and subjects within their own environment on a continuous basis is critical to this work. It also allows us to bring in multiple inputs, both objective measures, subjective measures, and also community measures around the environment that the individuals live in. And a lot of the work that Melvin and I do is working out how we best combine both objective and subjective measures to understand the most and gain the most insight. One important thing to consider in the space is that we're not trying just to reproduce lab measures in the field. When you look at the literature, you'll see very often very poor agreement between measures in the lab and within the field. And very often you recognize you're actually measuring something different and often something much more valuable. One of the important areas of thinking is making sure that we're collecting data in an open format so that we're creating a future resource for modeling and for research. And another area that we consider very carefully is making sure that we're avoiding technology bias when we're remote monitoring, making sure that we are not excluding participants on the basis of their digital literacy, their social economic backgrounds, or their geographic area, because using technology can be quite discriminating unless you do it carefully. So if the last slide was about reducing burden for patients, this is about reducing the burden for most of the people on this call, for researchers and clinicians. And that's within the services that we offer as Activity Informatics. We offer strategy services, helping people to define the problem and understand the real role of activity measurement in reaching the objectives. We offer services around design and planning, defining what resources are required, what equipment's required, how data is going to be managed, and understanding the complete data analysis approach from the beginning to the end. Also the day-to-day management, the deployment. This may seem simple, but we know from many years of running studies that the decisions that we make around study design dramatically impact the adherence we can get in the data we retrieve. And so running that deployment is a very important skill set that we can offer. As we move through the later stages, then we're summarizing data as it comes in through a trial. This may be quality data, for example, about non-wear, or management data to show that the trial is on track. And then lastly, we move into the interpretation and translation of that, understanding how we're going to do that up front within our design and planning, and then actually delivering that and showing impact, supporting publications, and proving progress towards objectives. This is another view of that same pathway, but more of an internal view within Activity Informatics, showing the tools and infrastructure that we use. We support UK-wide direct-to-patient deployment. Active Insights does, this is one of the questions that came up earlier, when Active Insights does support work on a worldwide basis. So it's something that we can talk about, but currently focus on UK-wide. We don't recruit patients directly, but we're very used to working with recruitment groups to be able to identify participants. Moving then into the stage of data collection and management, the bulk of the data that we collect will be hosted and managed within the University of Exeter facilities, but we also have access to commercial capabilities in the area as well. And these are particularly useful if we're collecting data for example, from the Internet of Things or other devices. So we're bringing together data, and we specialize in risk-worn raw data, but we also bring in data from other wearables, from other devices, and very often then subjective and clinical data as well. And it's very common for example, a 7-day deployment to be accompanied by a manual questionnaire for a sleep diary, and we bring those data in as well. In the data integration and analysis stage, we use typically Python and R as our analysis environments, using code from a number of sources depending on what matches the project needs. We always approach that with a view to using open algorithms, to implementing open algorithms in robust verified software, and to using that same environment to be able to develop new algorithms. I'm just going to drop into a little bit of detail now around the development of digital health measures. Here I focus on accelerometry because that's my area of specialism, and just show you some of how this layers up. The base level accelerometry allows us to measure motion and performance, and we can do that directly in SI units. We can talk about intensity of movement. We can look at micro patterns of movements in 3 dimensions. We can analyze posture. Once we've done that, we can start to build up to the next level and look at behavioral events over time. We can identify those in time by looking at changes in the data. We can then characterize those periods of data, and then we can infer their classification using the metrics that we've used to characterize them. And this might include activities of daily living, sleeping, sitting, walking, the general activities, but also specific behaviors of interest, for example, scratching or fidgeting, where we may be using machine learning or artificial intelligence approaches to be able to identify training data and relate that back to our wider data collection. On a layer above that, once we've got a sequence of events of distinct behaviours, we can build that up over a 24-hour cycle. And that helps us to build a picture of an individual. And this is where we start moving from talking about perhaps just discrete behaviours into lifestyle patterns, activity levels, temporal patterns, behavioural types. And Melvin is going to talk much more about this later on. We can also then understand aspects that may be more related to the phenotype, for example, chronotype, sleep preference. With a daily picture of the individual measured over multiple days, then we can get deeper insight still. And this is where typically we're looking at responses to interventions, responses to environmental changes, but also characterizing out the types of days and longer term trends in the data. And it's very often that when we look at the data at this level, we identify opportunities for segmentation, stratification, and enrichment within clinical trials that allow us to split patient populations and participant populations up into new and insightful groupings. You'll have noticed that I've stuck very clearly to talking about measures up until this point. And it's useful to be clear about what we mean and the differences about measures and biomarkers and then endpoints. We use a lot of FDA reference within our clinical trials work, and this definition is from the FDA. And it defines a biomarker as a characteristic that's measured as an indicator of normal biological processes, pathogenic processes, or responses to exposures or interventions. It then sets out the types of things that biomarkers may be, molecular, historic, radiographic, physiologic, and we add in behavioral within there as well. And importantly, it points out that a biomarker is not a measure of how an individual feels, functions, or survives. And from an FDA perspective, this is because these are clinical outcomes. Now, it doesn't mean that measures can't inform clinical outcomes. They do, but they're just not described as biomarkers in this sense. And then any of these can go on to become endpoints within a clinical trial. And that's why we stick to this term measures, because they can feel all these different areas. And then just down on the right-hand side, for interest, those are the categories of biomarker that the FDA recognizes. Once we've understood the biomarkers we want to work with, it's important to be able to describe how we validate those. And this is a model that we use. It has 3 stages of verification and validation. The first stage is an engineering task, making sure that a device is measuring what we think it's measuring, or that an algorithm is outputting what we think it should be outputting. We can then move that to an analytical validation, and this is where we bring together the engineering and the clinical side, and we're looking often here about performance against another criterion measure. And lastly, we need to still show that a biomarker has a health benefit themselves, and it's not just related to a criterion, that it has in itself impact within a health environment. And again, Melvin's going to touch on that in a moment. This is just a flash up of a slide to show that this work that we do is part of an international community. The work that I'm describing here has both been shared with and contributed to by the Digital Medicine Society, where we supported a program last year around standardizing digital clinical measures and language about them, both in clinical trials, clinical and also in public health. If you're not aware of this resource, there are over 400 slides which are open access, and I really recommend that this is something that people go and have a look at. So some of the recent areas of focus in the orthopedic area, Melvin's going to give some examples there, but in the cardiac area, we've recently supported both chronic heart disease and heart failure, rehabilitation trials, and I'm currently working on monitoring patients with implanted electrical devices. In children, we've looked at obesity interventions, PHE activity interventions, active travel program evaluations, and I've recently been doing some work around fidgeting assessment in ADHD. In frailty, we've looked at community interventions for physical function in the elderly, and we're doing a lot of work at the moment around biomarker development for pre-frailty. But these are just some groupings. We've also done work in inflammatory bowel disease, for example, recently, and I've touched on work in in programs within workplace health. So this doesn't restrict what we do, but it just gives you some idea of what's currently on our plate. So as a last slide, I put up our contact details here. I just wanted to talk about engaging with Activity Informatics. I'd like you to find us proactive, collaborative and consultative, and that's very important. Hopefully we'll have time for plenty of discussion in the call today, but where you've got particular questions, we encourage you to book an appointment, book us some time with Melv and myself, and we'll get on a call and talk about your particular challenges and opportunities. We're here to give you access to expertise, deployment services and infrastructure, and we can do that in a slightly different way, using a pay-as-you-go approach based on the data outputs that you need. The first starting point for Melvin and I when we look at these programs is to understand the number of participants, the number of measurement points, the amount of data that needs to be returned, and to work backwards from there. And the team at Exeter are excellent at being able to turn those into full economic costings, which are fully compatible with the major funders and JES, which is something that we've managed to prove over the last few years. So I'm going to pause there and change over and invite Melvin to take the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Joss. And so what I'm going to pick up on is just some of the points that Joss has raised there by using a single case study of a project we worked on recently. In fact, it's still ongoing because, as with many studies, it was interrupted by COVID. So we were approached by a team of orthopedic surgeons who wanted to use wearables for studying recovery after total knee replacement. However, when they first came to us, they weren't really sure what they wanted to do with wearables or how best to utilize them to answer the questions they were contemplating. So when we first met with them and had our initial consultations about how best we could help them, they had a few hunches about what they expected to see in people recovering from total knee replacement. So they believed, first of all, that pre-surgery levels of physical activity would be associated with patient-reported outcome measures, such as pain and quality of life. And they also believed that the trajectory of physical activity immediately after surgery would also be associated with patient-reported outcomes. And they had a particular view about how all that pattern of recovery would be related. So if you look at the image on the left, that's their preferred trajectory. So that's what they expect to happen and would be expected to be associated with positive outcomes. So a very steady day-by-day increase in physical activity would reduce the risk of harm and maximize the return to pre-surgery levels of fitness. What they don't like seeing is the trajectory on the right, where people feel, okay, I've got this new knee, I can just go nuts now and I can go and do loads of physical activity, and then discover that they've injured themselves. They then wait until their pain has gone down again and rest, and then they have another go, but overdo it yet again. So they wanted to have some insight into the trajectory of physical activity day by day after their surgery. So we sat down with them, talked about how the study design should work in order to answer some of those questions. So it was clear that a device-based measure that had a timestamp would be particularly useful. And we definitely wanted a device that could be worn on multiple days over a reasonable period of time that would have high compliance. So we went for a wrist-worn device. Now, we decided to monitor people for 21 days prior to their surgery, 21 days immediately from discharge from the hospital, and another 21 days post-discharge. So the choice of 21 days was related to the data gathering period and the battery life of the device, but also a sensible period where we would have confidence that we could see a trajectory of what people were doing. Now, the patient-reported outcome measures are pretty common in surgery, and so they weren't things that we could maneuver. They were always the time points when they got recorded. So we worked around those time points with the surgeons. Activity Informatics provided all the necessary equipment, and Activity Informatics managed the deployment and retrieval of the devices, along with the research nurses who were supporting the study at the Royal Devon and Exeter District General Hospital. And in period A, people would be recruited to the study at the point in time they were told they were eligible for surgery. So we sent out the devices in the post with a prepaid envelope, and they were sent back to us. On discharge from hospital, we sent the devices to the research nurses because they, rightly so, didn't want us going on to hospital wards, and it wouldn't be that convenient either for us. And so they took with them into the hospital on the day of discharge a prepaid envelope with the device in. They placed the device on the patient, and then the patient would use the prepaid envelope to send the device back to us after 21 days. And then 3 months after post-discharge, again, we sent the devices out in the post, and the participants sent them back to us in the post. We obviously then did check the quality of the data, did the data downloading, and computed various summary measures that I'll share with you in a moment. So once we've done that, the next discussion with the consultants is what would be the appropriate metrics to use or measures to use in this particular study to answer the questions they are interested in. So those of you who've ever used accelerometers before will probably recognize this image. So this image just shows you a typical trace of accelerometer data with the acceleration value on the vertical axis and the passage of time on the horizontal axis. Now, the most common processing of accelerometer data is to a priori determine a particular threshold of acceleration and then count all the units of time, referred to as epochs, that the person records above that threshold. And people choose these thresholds, indicated here by the red dashed line, based on either published research or their thinking about what level of intensity of physical activity they think that level of acceleration will apply to. And they will normally give a label to that level of acceleration. And the most common label people use is moderate to vigorous physical activity. So any activity above moderate, and that's normally abbreviated to MVPA. Now on this particular slide, I've just arbitrarily put this in at 0.1 of a G or 100 milli-G, which is a common threshold people use for indicating moderate intensity for people who are typically above the age of 50. So then, as I said, what people do is just count normally seconds, how many seconds are spent above that line, and that produces one measure, which is an aggregate measure of time spent in moderate to vigorous physical activity, either time per day or time per hour, etc. And sometimes that's then used to say whether the people meet current public health guidelines or not, depending on the level or the time spent in MVPA that the person's recorded. Now, you can see why this particular metric isn't very helpful in the study that I've just described, where we're trying to understand the trajectory of recovery after surgery and what people would do in pre-surgery, because what we don't want is a single aggregate measure. We want to be able to plot what people were doing over time. Now, the reason that's problematic, of course, is that we can have 3 people who record exactly the same amount of moderate to vigorous physical activity per week or per day as an average measure, but they might have very different lifestyles. So the first person might be an office-based executive, the second person might be a nurse, and the third person might be a construction worker. Now, how they accrue their time in moderate intensity physical activity is inevitably going to be different. So, for example, they actually might accrue different activities on different days of the week. So the executive might not do much during the week, but might do more at the weekend. The nurse might be active more during the week on shift and might add to that a little bit at the weekend. And perhaps the construction worker gets all of their activity during working hours and is too exhausted to do anything at the weekend. So we have variations between days in how people get their physical activity. It might also be the case that people vary in how they get their activity within a day. And you will see very different patterns across these types of employees. And you can pick out, for example, commuting patterns. So you might see activities clustered around typical commuting hours. You might see activities clustered around evening only, and you might make some assumptions about what that's doing. or you might see activities clustered around work hours. So we can see differences between days and within days. Now, we also might see differences between these types of people, these three different particular people, in the intensity of the activities that they're doing, indicated in red, but also in the duration of these activities. So you can see that how people accumulate a given volume of activity can vary considerably. And these different patterns of accumulation might be strongly related to different disease outcomes. And yet these patterns are masked if we just use one single value, which is an average volume measure of physical activity. So we adopted for this study what's referred to as an event-based approach. So rather than drawing a line through the data and counting time spent above it, what we do is go through the data and use two simple classifications. So we label the data as either active or inactive events. And each event has got a timestamp that tells you when that event started. So once we've got a time series of events, we can characterize each of those events by various characteristics. We might choose, for example, to characterize the event by its duration. So we know how long in seconds the event lasted, the active event or the inactive event. And long active events, for example, might indicate intentional activity, whereas more sporadic active events that are short might indicate activities of daily living, like moving around at home or at work. We can also look at the mean intensity, which we stick to the SI unit, which we record in G. And for each event, we can simply say what was the average acceleration value for that particular event, with the interpretation that higher intensity values would correlate with higher intensity activities, and lower intensity events would be more associated with lower effort activities, such as activities of daily living again. And what we often see is within any given event, there's variation in that intensity. So the person's not staying at the same intensity all the time, although on some occasions, if perhaps you were running on a treadmill, it would be. But we can characterize the intensity of the event in different ways. We can then use the information on duration intensity to describe the volume of the activity in the event. So this would be recorded in G seconds as just a sum of the G values per unit of time for the duration of the event. And this gives us an indication of the amount of work done per active event. And so you can imagine that more intense or longer bouts of activity will give you a higher volume. We might be more likely to get those for playing sports or a continuous period of walking. We might then have an event that has a lower volume in it, and that might be because it's being done at a lower intensity, or it's more sporadic, again, such as activities of everyday living. We can also produce metrics that characterize the variability within the day. And so this example just shows how varied the volume of activity is hour by hour within the day. And we might find that high levels of variability indicate more short events spread throughout the day, interspersed with some more intense events. And that might be activities of daily living interspersed with a commute or a purposeful walk, for example. Or we might see lower levels of variability. And this would mean that there's similar levels of volume being undertaken each hour. Now, that could be just because the person's not doing much activity throughout the course of the day, and they're just gently moving around at home, not with no higher intensity bouts interspersed with those. Or we might see more continuous higher levels of volume of activity, and that might be someone who's engaged in a more manual task where that active fairly consistently throughout the day. Now you can see how this pattern metric of how people are moving around over the course of hour by hour, if we combine that with a volume metric, we can start to get a good understanding of how people are accruing their particular level of physical activity. And we can also look at this in terms of differences between days, not just within the day, and we can compute similar metrics. Finally, once we've characterized the events, we can assign labels of the behavior that people are doing during the event. Now, for the knee study, the obvious one is to look at stepping. Now, I don't have time to show you loads of results from the stepping study, and the stepping study hasn't finished, but I will just give you a couple of insights based on some stepping data to show you how we use the data and how it's linked to the questions we were set out with at the beginning when we were consulting with the surgeons. So this is just some data from the period A, which is pre-surgery, period B, immediately post-discharge, and period C, 3 months after discharge. So this is just looking at the total number of steps per day for each day of the 21 days immediately post-surgery. This slide shows you days 2 to 20, because typically day 1 is not a full day and day 21 isn't a full day. And what you can see is a typical pattern of stepping per day in people of an age group that would be usually eligible for knee surgery, so middle and older age. So people are doing between 5,000 and 7,000 steps per day in this particular study. But then the interesting thing, of course, is from the day after they leave hospital, you see, as expected, a very big drop in steps per day, but then this slow trajectory day by day upwards towards what they were doing pre-surgery. Now, what you can also see in that 3-month period, or the 3 months after discharge, the subsequent 21 days, that trajectory is still going upwards. So most people, after 3 months from their surgery, haven't quite reached pre-surgery levels of stepping per day. And this actually came as quite a surprise to the surgeons, that the return to baseline levels of physical activity was slower than what they were expecting to see. Now, in this slide, it's the same data, but we're only focusing on high cadence stepping. And high cadence here was around about 100 steps per minute. So a bit more what people might describe as a brisk walk. Now here, what you can see is the number of steps per day are much lower, unsurprisingly, because now we're talking about faster stepping. But what you also see in the period after surgery is a much slower recovery to higher cadence stepping. So in the previous slide, pretty much day by day, there's an increase in stepping. So people are generally starting to move about a bit more. But when we look at higher cadence stepping, there's perhaps a week where people aren't really re-engaging with higher cadence stepping, and then it much more slowly starts to increase. So one interpretation of this is that what people do initially is just slowly start to move around a little bit more at home, trying to gauge how much pain and movement they've got and what function they've got. And as they get more confident and their pain reduces, then they start to engage in more higher cadence stepping. And you can see this starts to increase from the day of discharge, but also it's much higher then than 3 months later, when hopefully their pain is reducing, then they're becoming more confident. And you can see by the end of that 21-day period that people are starting to get beyond their baseline levels and engage in higher levels of stepping more frequently. So that's just an idea of some of the results that we presented back to the surgeons. And this was some of their interpretations of what was going on, that return to baseline levels of physical activity take longer than expected. We probably need another follow-up measure because we haven't reached that point where people are plateauing and they're still in recovery 3 months after the surgery. Now, the surgeons thought these kinds of insights were brilliant for them and can help manage patient expectations. Now, what they also told us was that knee surgery is really successful, but there's a hard core of maybe a fifth of patients that are not satisfied with their surgery at either 3 months or later down the line. And one of the reasons they think this is the case is that perhaps they have unrealistic expectations pre-surgery. And the sort of data we've presented back to them quantifies what's going on, and they can use that to better help people manage their expectations. Now, one of the other things they found really interesting was that these time varying data, so really high resolution day by day data and even hour by hour data, give them insights they've not seen before. And maybe that's what they should be doing with their measures of pain and quality of life, because they only measure these at fixed time points. And what you have to wonder is, what are the patients recording or responding to when they're being asked at just 6 weeks and 3 months about their pain? Are you asking them to aggregate their pain through the whole period, or are they only telling you about the pain on the day they fill in the questionnaire? Now, if you want to understand the relationship between physical activity and pain and quality of life, for example, then these things co-vary with time. So if you do a bout of activity, that might increase your pain or it might reduce your pain immediately afterwards. Well, you're not going to get that detail if you only ask people about their pain 6 weeks later. So what the surgeon said they definitely need to do is develop time varying measures of both pain, quality of life, function, etc., that can be asked multiple times per day and multiple times after surgery. And then we can align the accelerometer physical activity data with time varying measures of pain and quality of life, and look at the bi-directional relationship between pain, quality of life, and physical activity. And this emphasizes Joss's point that we can bring in data from other devices to give a much deeper picture of what's happening in a particular disease or condition, like people suffering, recovering from pain after total knee surgery. So depending on the study's question, we can also develop other outcome-specific measures. And I'm just going to show you a quick example of one or two other measures that we've worked with. So we've done work with patients with heart failure, where the overall level of physical activity isn't of interest to the researchers. What they're interested in is the patient's capacity to sustain continuous periods of activity. Because one of the things that characterizes heart failure is the inability to continue physical activity for more than a few seconds or minutes without being out of breath. So a good outcome from an intervention is to extend the period at which people can go before they get out of breath. And of course, that opens up multiple activities of daily living that perhaps they couldn't do before. So one of the metrics we used for that is to look at the cumulative frequency plots of duration. So we can do this at an individual level, or we can do this at a group level. So what you're looking at on the left here is group level data from some heart failure patients. And we can just look at what duration of activity can a given proportion of these patients engage in. So we can perhaps take the median value. So we can look at what's the average duration of activity in half the patients, and what can they do above or below that. And you can see here, without me drawing lines on this, that the average duration, or the duration of activity that half the patients could do, is around about 300 seconds. So if we look at all of the events they record in their data, and unsurprisingly, as we go to the right of this data set and look at longer duration events, a smaller proportion of patients are able to do this. Now, the nice thing was, if you were doing an intervention study where the aim was to increase the capacity of heart failure patients to endure continuous exercise, and you were going to compare those with people in controls, you could have two lines on this plot, one representing intervention patients and one representing control patients. And what you'd hope to see is a different shape for the line for the intervention patients, where a greater proportion of people are able to do more duration. Now, what we've done on the right is combined frequency with duration. And so it's the same plot, but we're looking at what's the duration that people can sustain and how frequently do they do that. So we can look at what's the duration of activity that people do daily, or what's the activity that people only do once a week. And if you look at the pink line to the right, that's what people do at least once per week. And as you can, or as you imagine, that might mean a longer duration event, like walking to the shops, etc. But when we look at the duration of events that they do at least once every day, that's much closer to around 15 minutes for at least half of these people. So you can see that when we work with groups, what we're really interested in is trying to think about what's the best presentation of the data and what are the measures that we should compute for this study that best answer the question that the researchers are trying to address, rather than say, well, we've only got access to these metrics, so we'll try and shoehorn this metric into the study itself. We work with people to try and think about what's the best metric or best measure that we can use for any given study. So I'll stop there and thank you for listening and hand you back to Hannah to take perhaps some of your questions that you've been posting or thinking about.
That's super. Thank you so much, Joss and Melvin, for that overview of the use of wearable technology for measuring lifestyle behaviours and their health impacts. I hope you all found the information valuable for considering how this can be applied to your needs. And as Melvin said, it's now over to you. If you do have any questions for either or both of the speakers, please do put these into the chat function. Or if you would prefer to ask your question directly, please could you raise your hand using the reaction button on the toolbar, and I'll try and come directly to you. We didn't have anything come through on the chat as we were talking, but we did have a couple of questions submitted before we had the webinar. So I'm going to start with a couple of those. So this is for both of you. So what are the differences between the clinical trial markers and those that are used in public health?
So I'll start on that moment. I think so. So Melvin's given a really nice, more of a clinical example there rather than a public health example. It's very feasible to use the same biomarkers, and I think some of the challenges are to be able to use the same biomarkers. One of the things that you realise very quickly when you look at biomarkers at a population level compared to an individual level is the level of accuracy at which they're useful. At an individual level, if you've got for example, a diagnostic test which has got an accuracy of 60 or 70%, that's just not useful for an individual. But those are very useful at a population level when you've got sufficient power within the numbers. Equally, trying to find the measures that are meaningful at an individual level can be more important than a public health level as well. There's a different level of messaging about if you're facilitating a particular behavior change as opposed to public health messaging. And so understanding what meaningful means is different. So I think the underlying measures can be the same, and we can actually think about using things with a lower accuracy rate because of the higher power within public health. But in both circumstances, we still need to think about what makes it meaningful. I don't know, Melvin, if you've got anything to add to that.
Someone's just dropped a question in the chat about whether you can tell me the equivalent cutoff value of 100 minutes of moderate activity and 75 minutes of vigorous activity based on the WHO guidelines. And that overlaps with this question. So for example, if we want to help a clinician work with an individual patient, and a clinician is trying to understand, for example, the relationship between the person's lifestyle and their continuous measures of blood glucose, then we can provide them with within and between day data on activity, so that when they sit down with a patient and they're looking at their blood glucose data, they can see how their patterns of physical activity might be influencing their blood glucose. So that individual level data will be really helpful for a clinician negotiating perhaps behavior change with their patient. But in the last year, I've been part of a group set up by the Chief Medical Officer who commissioned a group to think about how wearable devices could be used in population surveillance, which is related to the question that's been posted here. And one of the things that was raised during that year of consultation was that wearable devices are not necessarily best placed for monitoring compliance with physical activity guidelines that were derived purely from self-reports. So the WHO guidelines, the UK guidelines, and most guidelines around the world were developed based on epidemiological studies from self-reports. And those guidelines obviously can refer to patterns of behaviour that were derived from self-reports, but also that's where estimates of moderate and vigorous came from those self-reports. And obviously our wearable devices are measuring something else. They're measuring movement in acceleration values. And in the final report that was submitted to the Chief Medical Officer, it was agreed that actually the perfect solution is a combination of self-report and wearable devices because they provide complementary information about what people are doing in populations. And so what the accelerometers would be useful for is providing objective data that's not subject to recall or desirability bias on trajectories of physical activity over time. Now, trajectories of physical activity over time could be subject to differences in desirability bias. So if messaging around physical activity was being successful, people knew what they should be doing, then over time, you would imagine desirability bias might go up, and you might get a false suggestion that your population prevalence was increasing. While a device-based measure, which was repeated over time, is not subject to that bias, and therefore you get much more concrete measure of physical activity and its trends over time. The other main finding that we reported back to the chief medical officers, if you wanted to understand that subgroup analysis, so whether physical activity at the population varied within groups by ethnicity or socioeconomic group or gender, for example, then you're much better to be able to quantify the magnitude of those differences with an objective measure. And that's because the types of activity that people do have varying levels of recall bias. So we know it's much easier for people to recall whether they played sport versus whether they moved around in the house all day. It's very hard for them to accurately say how often they moved around in home, got up from a chair, went up and down stairs. So if in a particular population subgroup sport was more common, then you'd be less subject to recall bias. And we know that's true across socioeconomic groups. Whereas on the other hand, if activities of daily living were more common in another population group, that's really subject to recall bias. So you can artificially get difference in populations, such as subgroups by social class or by ethnicity, that aren't real when you measure them with an objective device. And so that was one of the recommendations that went back to the CMO. You can use both sets of information because they provide unique information that complements each other. So they don't, an objective device isn't better than a self-report device and vice versa. They both have their attributes that you can use to paint a fuller picture.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much for that one. We have a hand up from the event participant with the username of GUUTW. So if I can get you to unmute and ask your question, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Ta Wei, or David. I'm actually a psychiatrist and a PhD student in King's College London. We have been working with Active Insight happily for more than 1 year, since before the COVID actually. But unfortunately, we're actually recruiting patients with severe dementia and also those agitation and aggression behavior. So hopefully we can get more data to work with your data scientists. But before this, could probably Jules tell me more about how do you use or apply machine learning in this ADHD project, exploring fidgeting?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that. Actually, the techniques that we're using at the moment are much more of a descriptive basis to understand what's going on in the data, rather than trying to apply machine learning techniques, just because the data is quite difficult to get hold of. And we've got some very good early data within that. One of the interesting things is that Melvin's shown some slides there about activity levels. And what we've been able to do in some of the early stages is just to be able to understand the difference of some of the movements of sort of fidgeting type activities, which might be agitation activities as well, and make sure that we're not falsely classifying those as physical activity, non-sedentary behaviors, that where people are actually up on their feet and moving around the place. And this actually speaks to a little bit of some of the questions within the chat as well. A lot of the time, we are trying to disprove some of the negative hypotheses first. And so within fidgeting, the first question we'll need to ask is, can we tell the difference between people not doing anything, being very still, sleep or non-wear, those type of activities? Activities when they are expressing physical activity, which would be considered something that impacts them on at a metabolic level, compared to those actions which are movements at a physical of their hands at a micro level. So that's the first stage that we've been able to do. And then we've been looking at those micro movements to be able to identify how they predict the different categories of participant that we have within the study. And those are using pretty standard statistical techniques at the moment. As we get more data, there will be an opportunity to do more in that area. But even then, we're not necessarily using machine learning techniques. Some of the recurrent quantification analysis that we've done within the group with Exeter has been very, very good at looking at small repetitive behaviours. So hopefully that gives you a feel about where we are, even if it doesn't answer your question directly on machine learning. I think actually, just let me answer. There were two questions there. One about sleep. Hannah, if that's okay, just while we're...
Yeah, please carry on, Joss, no problem.
An accelerometer and a raw data accelerometer. You see, this is mine here with a funky orange strap on. But most people are aware that when they're moving, they're a really good proxy for intensity, and that we can write algorithms for them that will extract things like step count as well. And I can talk about the validity of those measures. But one of the interesting things is that when they're not moving, an accelerometer, because it measures acceleration, we all experience 1g of acceleration keeping us on the ground all the time as gravity, they actually turn into very, very precise posture sensors or position sensors of the arm. And so when you're looking at things, for example, you're trying to detect really difficult things like eating. So it would be quite difficult to measure eating. And I know there are some studies that have been done in the space, but one of the things that you can detect is the fact that people are most likely to be in a seated position with their arms up. And you can then look at transitions between your arm being up and then your arm being level. One of the interesting things about being sat at a table, if you're eating at a table, is that your arm can't drop below the horizontal. Although we have done studies in this and already been unstuck by people eating standing up, and you get some different behaviors as well. So things like eating are very difficult, but what we can do is we integrate them with other measures. And a classic example of this is nocturnal scratching. So the motion of scratching could be confused with many, many different activities. But if we bracket ourselves just to look at scratching at night, we give ourselves a much better chance of improving our specificity to a point where we've got a usefully accurate measure. And so you could do that in a number of different ways. You could do that with diaries, works quite nicely. Or if you wanted to be precise, you could use phone-based techniques or even bed-based sensor technologies. So, for example, in food activities, if you could identify areas when the light's beating and then look at measures in that space, you can get close to measuring those sorts of things. And equally then in sleep, we can measure changes in posture. And so the number of posture changes during the night is easily measured with an accelerometer. And quite often one way to think about what an accelerometer can do is to quantify things that you would normally capture with video. And certainly video-based sleep analytics correct and it's associated very, very strongly with accelerometer-based things. So things you can measure on video, you can normally not only measure on with an accelerometer, but you can also quantify in a way which makes them more useful, either longitudinally within a study or across a population.
Super. Thank you so much, Joss. So we're coming towards the end of the session already. I can't believe how quickly that's gone. So I'm going to try and squeeze in two more questions because I know Sarah's got her hand up, but there's one that's come in on the chat, which is how valid is the estimation of steps from wrist-worn accelerometer? And I know that was probably very closely related to the case study you presented, Melvin. So I wondered if you might want to take that one.
Hello, Aidan. You could just phone me up and ask me that. We know Aidan. There's obviously a number of published studies now, validation studies for wrist-worn estimates of stepping, which look quite good. We've worked on one for ourselves using the Gene Active, and I can't give you an F1 score off the top of my head, Aidan, which you probably want, but the estimates of daily steps, so the steps per day, is really good. And we've been working on just checking the validation for steps in different step rates per day, but that looks pretty good as well. So if those are the estimates you want number of steps per day for separate days, and you want to look at the number of steps per day at different cadences, then that works really well as well. I should say one of the interesting things that came out of this when we were looking at these algorithms, other people's and the one we've worked on, is that you need to be quite careful about what's going on with the noise at the bottom of the acceleration signal. So there's a lot of steps that people assume when they're reported from any device, not just a wrist-worn device, that they think is walking. So people assume if I'm reading 5,000 steps from a study, whether it's come from a device, a commercial device or a device strapped for your thigh or one on your wrist, that all of those steps are walking. And it turns out an awful lot of those steps are simply shuffling about, moving from one foot to the other, just taking very small movements in and around the home. And there are ways of filtering that and being clear when you're interested in just the walking steps. And it's interesting when you look at the clinical validity of some of those things, it goes in the opposite direction. So if a lot of the proportion of steps per day are made up from all that shuffling around, that's actually more indicative of a poor health status if it's not interspersed with more continuous periods of stepping that are occurring at a slightly higher cadence. So hopefully that's a sort of general answer. We're planning to write this paper up and submit it fairly soon. And so keep an eye out for that.
It was presented at ICANN last year, so there is something out there.
Fantastic. And Aidan's responded to that one already. So thank you for that, Melvin. So Sarah Dean, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question, we'll hopefully be able to squeeze you in as well.
Hi, Melvin. Great, really interesting talk about the knee study. I wasn't entirely surprised that it takes longer than 3 months to recover from knee surgery. I would have thought that, they would have expected it to take people a bit longer than that. So it's about changing the surgeon's expectations as well as the patient's, I think. I was interested in the idea around having other measures going alongside the activity measurement. And, I do think it's really important that they measure pain medication use, because I think that really impacts on people's recovery and their activity levels following that type of surgery. And then the question I have for you is, your wearable devices are obviously getting more sophisticated in analysing movement. And I wonder, do you have the ability now to measure knee exercises or, actual specific rehabilitation exercises that a physio might give to a patient, as opposed to just physical activity?
Great question. I think Joss
Sarah.
had a good reaction to that one as well. So Joss, if you want to kick off.
I think it is difficult. I think one of the interesting things when you start recognizing from using a machine learning approach to be able to identify what those physio exercises look like, you may well not be able to identify particular periods where they are doing their exercises. And I know that's a holy grail. And we actually would use app-based technologies to assess that. But you will be able to see the amount during the day, the amount of physio type exercises that are done. And so I think you'd be quite likely to find good correlations just by understanding what those activities look like and see how much of the day those are being expressed. And then the discussion that Melvin presented in terms of the intensity and the bout lengths associated with them, I think would be very instructive.
Yeah, I think that'd be really useful. Great. I'll come and talk to you, Melvin.
I was just going to say, Sarah, as well, I probably misrepresented the surgeons. So this was not the recovery per se that the patient was expecting. I think it was the fact that you'd imagine that the physical activity levels of patients at end stage arthritis who have been waiting for a year or two for a knee would be pretty low because of the amount of suffering they engage now. So that they might imagine that when you'd had your new knee, that 3 months later, you might at least have got past the level of activity that you were doing just before you had the surgery, rather than being fully recovered to what perhaps your expectation as the patient was, which I would imagine would be probably a bit better than what you were doing just before you had the surgery. And I should say, Sarah, we've also spoken with there's a patient-reported outcome measure team at the University of Exeter who also been working with the knee surgeons and the orthopedic team overall, and we've presented this to them, and they're really interested in the use of momentary assessments for patient-reported outcome measures, not just within knee surgery but across the board, because they recognise that pain, medication use, mood, for example, quality of life, vary across the course of the day, and that's bound to be related to some aspects of physical activity. So I think there's lots of potential for combining things that clearly do vary within and between days.
Brilliant. So we're out of time. That has shot by. So I firstly wish to thank the speakers, Joss and Melvin, for their presentations and their time for answering your questions. I hope we've shed some light on this topic for you. On screen now, you should see the contact details for Activity Informatics. So if you did have any further questions or would like to discuss your research needs in more detail, please do get in touch. As I said at the start, we will be circulating a copy of the recording and the contact details after this event as well. I also want to thank you all very much for your participation in today's webinar, and I hope you found the information presented beneficial. And I wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you ever so much. Bye.